Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone who's joining us today at this webinar that we designed in the framework and under the umbrella of the Erasmus Plus EQUAMLA project with the great support of Obriel Global, the Colombian Association of Universities. Would like to stress our interest to continue talking in general about all of the changes and trends of quality assurance in the world, but today focusing on micro-credentials. And aside from these general ideas, we also want to talk about some elements related to how to bring the concept of micro-credentials into practice in our specific context of higher education in Colombia. For the opening of this event, we have Dr. Juan Guillermo Hoyos, current Secretary General of the Colombian Association of Universities. Dr. Juan Guillermo. Elizabeth, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to greet you from the Colombian Association of Universities, ASCUN, on behalf of the Management Board and all of the rectors. It is a pleasure to be here at this webinar with a topic that we believe to be very timely. We are developing it, as Elizabeth said, in the framework of an Erasmus Plus project, which is EQUAMLA, of which we are partners, and our allied entity, Obriel Global, is also a member. And I would like to talk about this. With Obriel, we have been working for more than a decade now. They're an alliance that started in order to strengthen the work initially done between Europe and Latin America. But as of today, with Obriel, practically all regions in the world work with Obriel. And the idea is to facilitate this dialogue between universities and higher education, both intra-regionally and in between regions. From ASCUN, we contribute with especially the work in Latin America, in South America. So this is something that we would like to continue promoting, because based on the dialogues conducted between the different regions of Obriel Global, we identified that this topic today is of interest to all regions. And we see that working in the recognition of credentials is not only about approaching the formally granted certificates, graduate or pre-graduate or postgraduate courses. As of today, the presence of micro-credentials or insignias is ever more present, or badges is ever more present, and how employers are starting to see this as more relevant. And we see that there are many institutions outside of higher education that offer this. And it is very important to tackle this from universities, from higher education, because this is not something that is alien to us. It's something that we must incorporate, but we need to know how to do it, what we're talking about. And therefore, Elizabeth was saying that here we want to take one more step vis-a-vis how we manage this within universities, how we incorporate this. We've seen that effectively the profile of graduates improves a lot more when this is tackled from universities. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to our partners, of course, Obriel and all of the members of EQUAM-LA joining us in these efforts. We hope that this dialogue we will have with experts from Colombia and Europe will allow us to gather some elements that help us advance as a region and in the development of this Latin American and Caribbean space in higher education and the integration with the other regions of the world, especially now with Europe. Thank you very much. Dr. Hoyos, thank you so much. I'll pass the floor over to Professor Ramon Torrent, President of Obriel Global. Professor Ramon, Professor Torrent. Good afternoon, good morning. Very briefly on my side, I would only like to thank you all for the opportunity that you have given us for Obriel Global to continue to play its role as a bridge between Europe and Latin America and all regions in the world. I would like to show our appreciation to ASCON and their management team, Juan Guillermo Hoyos. I would like to thank the University of Murcia and our dear friend Cecilia Ruiz for all of the work that they are conducting. And I would like to tell you an idea, which is very brief. All of this idea of the execution of these European programs is to execute them with full precision and rigor, but at the same time to project them towards new topics, to go beyond, to go to topics that have come up after the initial proposal, and in this projection towards the future and towards other topics, giving another life, a new life to the project other than the one it originally had. So the webinar today is perfect from this point of view because starting with quality assurance, it takes us onto, it projects us onto an essential topic of development and creation of the curriculum and employability. So I would like to congratulate ASCON for having been creative and imaginative enough to design this webinar. Thank you very much again. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Professor Torrent. We would like to thank everyone who has joined us from different countries. We would like to remind you that you have the option of using simultaneous interpretation. You can see at the bottom of your screen, there is a globe with the word interpretation. And there, those of you who speak Spanish can choose Spanish, and if you need English, the other way around.
And talking just in English, we have the possibility or the option of simultaneous translations. So for that, please choose the globe at the bottom of your screen, and in that button you can choose the language you want to hear. No, you can choose the Spanish to hear all the webinar. Bueno, les queremos compartir brevemente.
And well, we would like to briefly share with you the agenda that we will follow today. And we would like to, of course, thank our speakers. From Colombia, we will have Alejandra Maria González, Director of the Javier U College, Carlos Eduardo Cortés, Director of Social Communication Studies. Cesar Tulio Osa apologizes because he had a last-minute issue, but Alejandra will tell us about the experience he was going to describe. And we would like to thank especially Juan Felipe Aramburu. He will talk to us from the industry point of view. And of course, our two international experts, our guest speakers. We know, well, they will talk about the development of micro-credentials and quality assurance in Ireland, Dr. Brian Maguire and Professor Mac Brown. And what we will do in this time that will be together is first we will hear from Professor Mark Brown with an introduction to micro-credentials. After that, we will hear of the Colombian case study with the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana and the development in different areas. And then we will hear from Juan Felipe Aramburu and his comments. After these three presentations, we will launch a survey for all of our participants. And then based on the results of this survey, we will hold a live conversation. On the second part of today's webinar, we will focus on quality assurance of the credentials. And for that, we will have Dr. Brian Maguire, very well known, very experienced in quality assurance, generally speaking, in higher education and specifically for micro-credentials as well. And for the second part of the agenda, there will be a second survey. And based on the results of this second survey, we will have a debate especially related, particularly related to quality and micro-credential. So thank you very much for joining us in these reflections. And without further ado, I will pass the floor to Professor Mark Brown. And I would like to say that Professor Brown is the first professor on digital learning in Ireland and director of the National Institute for Digital Learning at the University of Dublin. He is a member of the executive committees of the European Network of Distance Learning and E-Learning and the European Association of Distance Universities. He's from New Zealand, if I heard correctly, and he has great connections with the South, and he establishes communication bridges between different countries. He is also vice president of the Open Learning and Distance Learning Association of Australia, and in 2017, he was recognized as a world leader of distance education, even a few weeks before the outbreak of COVID in November. He was a president of the World Conference of Online Learning that took place in Dublin. And well, they told the world that this is a step that we had to take. And actually, a few months later, the world had to take this step. So Professor Brown, welcome, and we'll listen to you now.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm privileged to be here with you virtually today. It is a few years ago now, I think 3 years ago, when I was in your great country and indulging in some of your delights. I can't remember the name of the bowl of specialty drink that I had, but I did drink the whole lot, and I felt the effects quite quickly, I can say. So it's good to be here, and I'm conscious that I've added a lot more material than I probably need to cover, but I'm not sure what you know about micro-credentials. So I'm going to try to cover 3 questions, and I need to slow myself down just a little bit for my English and the translation. So what is a micro-credential? Why such a high level of interest in micro-credentials right now? And how do you go about implementing micro-credentials? I'll leave not so much on that last question, because I think that's what you're going to be talking more about over the course of your morning. 2 things to start off. I have already placed a link in the chat box to this journal article that was published earlier in the year, providing a global view of micro-credentials. And I have also put a link to what we call the Micro-Credential Observatory, which provides a lot of literature, the most comprehensive one place you could go to find all of the publications about micro-credentials. But let's get started. What is a micro-credential? Some of you may have, I suspect, more knowledge than others, and I won't take too long on this question, but it is an important question. I'm going to start by, in a very simple way, showing this landscape or this map of the credential ecology. All of us are familiar with degrees, or what I'm calling here macro credentials. What we now have are other types of credentials. And I heard in the introduction mention of digital badges. You will see in this diagram, I've made quite a distinction, made a difference between a digital badge or a certificate and what I believe we are leading towards being a formally recognized micro-credential. One is credit-bearing and the other is not credit-bearing. But this is a very simplistic way of looking at it, and there is leakage across these quadrants, these boundaries. But I hope this is helpful for those who are new. It is also quite important to start by saying that micro-credentials are not new. In 1833, in Canada, the St. John's Ambulance first offered their St. John's Ambulance certificate in first aid. And every year in Canada, 500,000 people do one of these certificates. So these are very credible, they're assessed, they have great currency. In fact, they are required for many jobs. In Australia, a recent study published this year found that these small bites of training are huge and hiding in plain sight. In fact, almost 2.5 million people do these courses. They typically are like what I described with first aid certificates, health and safety, forklift training, not qualifications that usually universities are involved in. Here in Ireland, last year, we did a national survey of micro-credentials. And in the survey, we surveyed employers as well as employees. And what we know is that in industry, only around half of the employers had ever heard of a micro-credential, let alone being able to define one. So we know that there isn't a clear definition. So last year, for almost the entire year, I had the luxury, or privilege is probably the better word, to be part of the European Commission's expert group to help develop a European-wide definition of micro-credentials. And this is the report we published. The report came up with this definition. A micro-credential is a proof of learning outcomes that a learner has acquired after a short learning experience. These learning outcomes have been assessed against transparent quality standards. So this is the working definition that we are now using in Europe. It took us a year to come up with this, and it's not the end yet. Earlier this year, the European Commission had a public consultation process to get industry, to get higher education, to get employees engaging and thinking about what micro-credentials might be. As part of the public consultation, our team I led conducted a major literature review on the state of art of micro-credentials. And I will share just some findings from the report that hasn't yet been published. And then only months ago, in September, UNESCO has started or building on a conversation of what is a micro-credential and towards a global definition, not just a European, but a global definition. And so this is a work that is still underway, and hopefully Colombia will benefit from these conversations. So in conclusion, in the answer to the question, what is a micro-credential? In Europe, we have a better sense of what we want one to be, but globally, there is no common definition. So the second part, why such an interest in micro-credentials? Well, there are many, many reasons. And I mentioned the literature review that we looked at. I'm going to talk about some of these things that are in this analysis of the literature with examples in the next 5 minutes or so. You will see employability and lifelong learning stand out, but there are lots of reasons why micro-credentials are very topical. Firstly, the COVID crisis has fueled governments to help to get people back to work with short training opportunities. That's certainly the case here in Ireland. In fact, in Dublin, we had Google offer 1,000 scholarships for job seekers in partnership with the MOOC platform Coursera. These are Google Career Certificates, no university involved. Actually, MOOCs, the MOOC platforms, Coursera, edX, FutureLearn in our part of the world are very active in developing micro-credentials. There are actually over 1,000 micro-credentials, and you can see here how they're growing from last year to this year based on an OECD study just published. So there are some people who say, why micro-credentials? For the money, for the money. Well, there is an element that is true. There are the global market for online micro-credentials is expected to go up and up. In Australia, I'll give you an example, but there are critics who argue the unbundling of the degree into small parts is accepting the theory of neoliberalism and creating a market-driven higher education system. A bit like the supermarket where the learner is in control to buy their own learning, what they want. I've put Coca-Cola in the basket because maybe the learner does not always know what's best for them. I mentioned, though, that in Australia, the government has been very active in creating an online marketplace for micro-credentials, not just for Australian citizens, but for export education, as they call it, for global international students. In Alberta, in Canada, just recently, only 2 months, 3 months ago, they've announced a 5 million Canadian project to develop micro-credentials with universities, but not for making money so much, but for reskilling the workforce. And reskilling is certainly one of the reasons in Europe micro-credentials are very popular. It's estimated that we're going to have to reskill half the workforce by 2025, half the world's workforce. So in Europe, we have the European Skills Agenda, where micro-credentials are key to upskilling our population, particularly in light of the changing nature of work. However, there's another element. In the United States, President Trump, last year, when he was still in office, signed an order to stop hiring people for jobs, for government jobs, based on degrees, but rather based on their skills. And the reason for this, remember, this is the United States, not Europe, but a perception that universities are no longer preparing graduates with the right types of skills. In fact, this is called the sheepskin effect, that in many cases, going to a university in the past was what mattered, not what you necessarily studied, because the degree gave you advantages. There are now questions about whether the degree, the traditional degree, is still relevant. Coming to the end of this second section, remember, I don't have too much in the last part. Perhaps the strongest reason why micro-credentials in Europe have become so topical is because we have actually a very low rate of lifelong learning, and particularly in Ireland, measured on a standard basis. More up-to-date data here from the OECD. You can see that Ireland has a higher average than the average for the OECD. Colombia doesn't appear on this scale, but I'm assuming that you similarly have challenges. In fact, I'm working with Costa Rica on a micro-credentialing initiative, and the reason for their focus is not so much about providing continuing professional development, but helping getting school leavers to continue with their education. So quite different from Europe. So I think context is very important here, because our focus tends to be more on postgraduate students, not undergraduate. In summary, here's a diagram of the data that I showed you at the outset. And employability and lifelong learning show up, but what don't show up in the literature we reviewed is promoting equity or promoting the Sustainable Development Goals, as an example. So sometimes it's the drivers or attractors that we don't see that we need to take note of. So this final section, I'm very conscious that I've gone fast and time is tight, but I won't take too long here because this is the hard bit. How do we implement them? This diagram or table comes from a report that it's not the detail I want you to focus on. It's more that there are different business models. There is the individual university offering micro-credentials. My university, Dublin City University, is setting out offering micro-credentials. Sole institutions. Then you have consortiums, groups of universities coming together, offering micro-credentials. I will give you an example. And then I heard at the outset the challenge that was made to do things differently, not just to unbundle the degree and make your modules or units a micro-credential. So the last column, what you see there is industry-led or industry co-constructed models, working with industry partners, the Googles and Microsofts and other large companies. Well, there are these different models. Our literature review identified 8 models. I just don't have time to cover them. But what we found when we reviewed the literature is that despite all the models, almost exclusively the literature is focused on higher education. 85% of the literature, the highly relevant column is European relevant literature. So the universities are dominating this area, the new types of micro-credentials, except they're dominating them not in consortiums, not in partnerships, but with the single business model. Here in Ireland, we have a national initiative funded by the government for 12 million euros, so very generous, for all of the universities to work with the Irish Universities Association to develop a national micro-credentialing system, a national portal. And you may hear a little bit more about that from the IUA talk later in the day from Ireland. My own university, though, is also party to a European-funded University Alliance initiative with 13 universities in total, 12 European and then Tec de Monterrey. And we're collaborating together, the ECIU University, to develop micro-credentials that all of our students can do. So this is a consortium model. Earlier this year, in January, if I will put a link to this report, we published our roadmap of how we're planning to implement micro-credentials in this consortium model. And that may be of interest. It's a different way of offering added value to your learners. 2 final points I want to make is in the European work, it is critical in our thinking that micro-credentials map or are embedded within the European qualification framework. You may hear again later from the Irish speaker around how Ireland's national qualification framework can support micro-credentials. So that is our thinking, to embed these. Also, it is important, without losing sight of why you're wanting to embark on micro-credentials, that you have the right technology and platforms to manage them. So again, in Europe, we have the Europass, where learners and citizens will be able to collect and present all of their qualifications. This is going to be a huge initiative, but it's still not complete. It's not something that's ready to launch in the way that you would want. Lastly, before I just sum up, in your thinking about micro-credentials today and in your own institution, when you're thinking about quality assurance in particular, are you seeing micro-credentials as being fully embedded, as I suggested? Or as we found in the literature, that many institutions, many universities just saw them as alternative or supplementary or additional? Your answer to that question changes what you think about in terms of quality assurance. So coming to the end, hopefully I'm still on time and I haven't talked too fast for everyone. One final comment to make. Micro-credentials are the buzzword. They're the next big thing right now. But in your discussions, I want you to think about what is the big idea that's underpinning micro-credentials. So in English, it says micro-credentials should be in the service of big ideas. They are not the big idea itself. What is it that you want to achieve by investing in micro-credentials, both in your institution, but importantly, as a country nationally as well? I'll stop on that note. I don't know if there is time for questions. I hope that has been informative and set the scene for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias,
Well,
Profesor.
thank you very much, Professor Brown. Thank you very much for this quick but substantial revision of why, how, when, and why of micro-credentials. There are some questions in the chat. However, Professor Brown, if you don't mind, we're going to keep going with the presentations. By the end of the conference, we will go into the session of Q&A in order to answer some of the questions. We want to answer the different questions posed, and we would like to thank everybody for the participation, people who are attending from different countries of Europe. Also, thank you for the presence of people coming from different countries of Africa, and of course, those of you coming from different countries of Latin America. Let me remind you that this webinar is being recorded. We're going to share the recording with all the attendees, and we also have a simultaneous translation in YouTube, which is hosting this webinar. Having said that, we are going to continue. Then we are going to listen to a case study, Colombia, with the Javeriana University. I would like to present Alejandra Gonzalez, Director of the College and Electronic Engineer, Doctor in Engineer by the same university, Professor since 2003, Research Activities and Development in Artificial Intelligence, Robotics and Innovation in higher education. Alejandra has been working in the reform of the curriculum design of several engineering programs, quality assurance, national and international leader of innovation projects and pedagogical projects, and she's been working in integration, active learning, and digital transformation in the area of education. Director of Electronic Engineer Programs, Research Telecommunication of the faculty as professor and researcher and director. Welcome, Alejandra. You have the floor. Good morning, Elizabeth. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Good morning, everybody. It's a great honor to be here with you, sharing my knowledge with you. Today, we have the opportunity to present from the Javeriana University two experiences. The one I'm presenting today, New College, which is a project which we're just launching and working on. And this is a projection of what for us is going to be the future of our university. In this meaning, lots of expectation and lots of hope of a new learning ecosystem in which we're going to relate and articulate different training levels in an ecosystem where formal and informal education are going to be the day-to-day of our university activity. So this is part of a macro institutional project under the leadership of our rectors, but especially with a partner relates in institutional relations. And here is where we are relating to this meeting and this talk today, micro-credentials and recognition in general. So it's going to be very clear all of a sudden, a very viable path to follow in order to start having all these elements with us. Having said that, what is the U College Javeriano. Within the learning ecosystem, we are working with the concept of flexible trajectories of learning of the UNESCO. These pathways or trajectories, as you know, are roadmaps, paths that go beyond programs and allow us to have several articulations among different levels of population, but also to welcome different populations. Mainly in the university, we welcome populations from specific ages that have already finished their college. They're in pre-grades. These are professionals who are going to enter into postgraduates, specializations, or doctorates. With the flexible learning trajectories, we are setting a very clear pathway for other populations. For example, relations with the schools, with populations at lower ages than the ones we're used to, or even other populations, such as older adults or people coming from technical and technological education. We welcome them into our professional education and learning and postgraduate course, however, with an idea of an ecosystem having other levels of training. So U College is a trajectory of access to the Javerian University, articulating different training experiences and learning experiences for a very specific population. Schools, 10th, 11th, 12th grades. In Colombia, many of you, we have up to 11 or 12 grades in some schools, and also for people coming out of school who don't know what to study or have not overcome an admission process. What we want is to introduce a network of mentorship in the schools, so the decision on the career a student will follow is accompanied by a higher institution such as ours, so they can move forward in their training path. So this is a process, U College, it's a personalized, tailor-made process for the vocational exploring and adaptation to university life. And there is another important element. It's because we're starting to have this concept of validating previous knowledge. So relating these students' history, their skills and weakness in order to empower them and to have a more effective transition into university. And this is why we are very much concentrated in enhancing skills. And in this point, it is important to tell you that our academic offer of pre-grade and postgraduate is training for learning results with transversal skills, integrated curriculums, not only developing disciplinary concepts, but also among the different skills transversal, such as documentation, working in teams, design thinking, everything that you are familiar with. So in the end, from the college, for example, I can trace a very clear pathway of skills, for example, working as part of a team at different levels of the school, but I can also trace a very clear roadmap towards pre-grades and postgraduate courses, a very clear roadmap. And this allows us to have evaluations and also to have different levels identified in the future to be able to certify them. Having said that, the U College Javeriano, this is the general diagram. I have already told you about the target population, 12th, 10th, and 11th grade, who have these vocational needs of preparation and exploring. And we have a process of working together with them by detailing their profile. At the college and our programs, what we do is to identify a profile of the student, a progress profile during the program, and also a profile at the exit, identifying with the profile the different skills that I'm going to develop. And in this case, what we do is characterize the student by taking a look at their results, which is the standardized test in Colombia, in order to evaluate the level of skills that I'm going to tell you about. This diagnosis in skills and knowledge, together with a profile of interest and motivations, allows me to create a profile of the student and to make a tailor-made offer to the student coming from school who can strengthen his or her abilities, or will have the opportunity to get to know different areas of knowledge in order for him to choose. So he has an informed decision about his future career. If someone, after establishing this profile, has to prepare himself according to some transversal traits to the U College Javeriano, which are these skills that are going to remain very clear along our programs. Well, there are others, but above all, oral and written communication, text production, oral communication, listening skills, logical and symbolic thinking oriented to information and data, statistics, graphs, problem resolution, and capacity to think in a holistic way in all dimensions in order to reach specific solutions. Citizenship training, especially for the University Javeriana of Integral Ecology, interculturality, foreign languages, technology, and digital competences. Although there are other competences and micro skills, but yes, of course, we do empower this transversality with these skills in order to develop from the preparatory cycle in school. If someone does not require this preparatory cycle, they can enter into the common cycle where they are going to find seminars and different subjects of the first semester of different programs so they can have this information and follow these subjects and of course choose a career. This is divided in 4 clusters: social and human sciences, arts, science and engineering, TICS and administrative, and health science and well-being. In the end, somebody is establish a profile, and then we know whether they have to be accompanied or strengthened in some skills of preparatory cycle, or if they reach a series of subjects and seminars where they're going to get to know their areas of interest. For example, sciences of health sciences are going to take a look at the medicine, odontology, nursing, or psychology, depending on the cluster. They can combine different clusters also. So this is a training from the school, and here there is a very strong relationship with each one of the institutions, with the schools, because here recognition is starting to be very relevant. Everything I do in my college is going to be recognized when I enter into a program, depending on the number of credits, but also everything I do during the college, if I stay in the college, is going to be recognized in the college as part of my advancement. So it's a double advantage. And this recognition is completed with 2 types of elements. One, digital insignias, allowing us to recognize in front of the college that he has been in a preparatory cycle or common cycle, and also following different subjects. And depending on the combination of the subjects, we have competences, roadmaps, and he can acquire macro certifications in each one of these skills of the preparatory cycle. What does this mean? It means that all these subjects are related via skills. So we have an identified pathway for logical and symbolic thinking. And as the student from the college is following these subjects and goes into each one of the subjects and careers, of course, he's going to keep increasing the level of competences and skills. And at certain times of evaluation, we are going to give him a micro certification. So here, the Vice Rector of Extension of Lifelong Learning is the one that follows the progress of the different skills, and we can give him this internal micro certification. In the case of the U College Javeriano preparatory, we have elements which are subjects with Javerian traits: humanities, theology, philosophy, and also experiences allowing the student to have this Javerian stamp of service to the community, which is so important for us. And just to conclude, let me just show you the link of the Javerian College, where you will find specific information related to the program, javeriana.edu.co college. And also, I will look forward to listening to your questions and information. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you very much, Alejandra. We know that it's quite complex information. You've been very generous, and we will share this information with the rest of the presentation here, so you can go deep into the subject. Now, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Cortés from the Javerian University, journalist, professor, and director of strategic communication with experience in ICT4D, in social web, e-learning, management of knowledge, and projects of development of media and international projects focused on journalism. Before, Mr. Eduardo Cortés was Director of Communication, Professor in Oral Communication,
editor de multimedia, entretenimiento
and multimedia developer, digital communication, and manager of the Center of Capacitation of Latin America, plus Director of Theology in Latin America. Carlos Eduardo, welcome. Thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Good morning. Thank you for your kind invitation. Thank you once again to ASCUN for organizing this important initiative. So I'm going to share my presentation. Very quickly, the idea is based on what Alejandra has already presented. The Javeriana University conceives all the university preparation as a learning ecosystem. In my case, I'm going to speak about the program of social communication at the Faculty of Communication and Language and the new study plan, which started from the authorization of the ministry in May 2020, what we call a new generation of social communicators with duration of 8 semesters. It used to be 10 semesters and 949 credits altogether. We're in process of qualification, high quality, going through the recognition of learning and teaching modalities and creation of specific skills. Our plan of studies is based on 3 pillars: disciplinar, common, and elective. And it's precisely within the selective pillar where, among other options, students can administer 24 credits, 17% of the curriculum. Co-terminal subjects, complementary subjects, digital insignia, this is what we are going to explain, mentions, which would be like a minor in front of a specific major, elective, and language levels. So our digital insignia would be precisely within the program of studies, a possibility that the students are taking on in a volunteer way, and normally half of the subjects during their normal process of the other training programs, and then at a given moment they will have a very specific digital insignia. We have 6 professional emphases, meaning that this vocational training of our pre-graduate program means 3 traditional ones: journalism, organizational communication, and advertising, and 3 emphases in creation and production in audio, visual, sound and radio, editorial, and multimedia. And it's within these contacts among these different professional emphases that we have generated our first digital insignias. And these are the undergraduate micro-credentials, which are different from the ones that we can have in the case of continuous education, or the ones mentioned by Alejandra in this induction to university from the U College. For us, is the possibility to follow some specific subjects within the study plan of social communication and obtain the flagship, crediting these skills as an area of specific knowledge with the support not only of the university, but also an international entity. Of course, we don't give them away. They have to course and follow the totality of the subjects between 9 and 12 credits, 4 subjects altogether, and obtain a qualification equal or higher than 4 in each subject, be in the North American qualification system. One of the specific aspects, for example, we have initially these insignias for new students, digital insignia in data analysis, where they have to go through subjects such as information and documentation, computational techniques in communication, visualization and data narrative and descriptive statistics, altogether 10 credits. And then the digital insignia in audiovisual production means foundation in audiovisual creation, audiovisual language, narrations and micro narrations from audiovisual point of view, and how do you tell about cinema, altogether 9 credits. And then the digital insignia in research in communication, go through the subjects of ethnography and multimodality, research and creation in communication, research, collaborative research in communication, and techniques of research. In this case, 11 credits. And finally, for the moment, our offer includes digital insignia in digital media, digital culture, communication and interactivity, visualization and data narrative, computational techniques in communication. All these insignias can be followed by students coming from other pre-graduate studies if they want to follow them. And there is this flexibility to follow them within our program. And then our own students will decide which type of insignia they're interested in. So this is an offer that is going to be growing depending on the 6 professional spheres, and that it's going to be developed together with offers of other pre-graduate students of the university. Expectations of our digital insignias to grow as an offer and menu, responding very well to the needs of the employers, of the context, and also development of our own discipline. So more or less, this is our proposal of digital insignia, started with these 3 cohorts so far. We're going to see results very soon by evaluating precisely this new plan of studies. So thank you very much. Carlos Eduardo, thank you very much. Thank you for showing us this initiative of the Javerian University. You're advancing together with other universities in the country. If you agree, Alejandro, Carlos Eduardo, there are some questions in the chat. Some of them can be answered in written, as Professor Brown has said. You can respond them while we launch the survey that we have. And by the end of the survey, we will continue with the conference. But of course, we are going to listen before the survey. We want to get to know this perception from other sectors, and not only to speak from the academy for the academy. And this is why we have invited Juan Felipe Aramburo, Director of Education and Culture. Juan Felipe from the Columbia University with studies in anthropology, Magister in Human Development, in Social Sciences. He has concentrated his work in the management of programs for students for the promotion of diversity and education as facilitator of social transformation. In the case of Joaquin, and he has also carried out and advanced the practical development of exchange with several students, with different youth groups and groups interested in artistic disciplines for education dimension, community perspective, and education in informal spaces of learning, which is also related to what we are presenting today. So let me remind you that you can prepare for the survey. And now we're going to listen to Juan Felipe. Thank you for accepting this invitation.
Espacio, yo intentaré ser lo más
very much. Possible. I have 5 ideas answering to what we have been debating about, and generally about the role of the social sector to accompany tertiary education via a grant system that, at least for Antioquia, is similar in terms of what it contributes. First, I would like to talk about an idea that was already mentioned for a country such as this one that tries to have particular development and sustainability practices, and that tries to become a country without an armed conflict. Thinking about full trajectories is not only a need, but also an emergency in the country. We are talking about a process that starts from early childhood to tertiary education, but at any rate, developing basic skills that allow for a better interpretation of the world and a better performance in the world we live in. And I think this is very important to propose, which is that you not only learn in formal education. Education is not a synonym for school or university. Universities and schools are institutions that promote education practices, but they're not the only ones. You can also learn at the park, at the village square, at a shop, at a company. And this understanding is very important because it will help us understand that formal education centers are not the only ones that educate. And in this regard, we need to move forward in terms of flexibilizing certain things, which does not mean not knowing the key role of the academy in training, the creation of human talent, human capital. Let's talk about human talent for now. And these institutions are very important, but they're not the only ones. The second idea is that I do believe that matters such as micro-credential helps us in democratizing access to certain types of knowledge. And I think it's important to be clear here, the access to higher education in a country such as Colombia, it's still for the elites. It's not universal yet, not at all. And it will not be, because in rural areas, for example, only 1 in 4 children accessing the first grade can finalize the cycle that gives them the certificate of high school education. And the transfer rate from basic education to tertiary education is under 50%. So accessing university in Colombia is for the elites and for a minority. Amongst other reasons, because of the absence of historical absence of universities in rural areas, which stops people from rural areas accessing tertiary education. In this regard, understanding that there are logistics aspects and other aspects that may stop this from happening. Talking about micro-credentials may help us talk about how to democratize access to university education. But when we talk about, or to education, when we talk about micro-credentials, we shouldn't talk about any sort of course. And maybe not pertinent. And I would like to say a couple of things. When we talk about pertinent, especially in contexts where there are no universities, where they do not have systematic access to tertiary education, we're not only referring to productive aspects. For example, we thought for a long time that people needed micro-credentials in banana growing because this is what's needed in the industry. And yes, of course, we need to give access to employability, but we cannot deny the other purpose of tertiary education, which is the flourishing of humanity. This is why we use the word university. When we have that word, when we use that word, we must not forget that we have to provide training in universal aspects, which give me a broader understanding and make me learn as a citizen and confronts me with different ways of seeing the world. So pertinence is not only related to what companies need, because businesses and companies cannot think that universities should solve all of their training needs one by one, because the training of the teams is also responsibility of the companies. And universities should not fall into the temptation of believing that they should design programs only for large corporations to hire their graduates with indicators that have been perverse incentives of the employability of graduates for some degrees, but they cannot say that they must not think that with micro-credentials, the only thing I get is a direct and easy link to the labor market. Micro-credentials can be an easy way onto the labor market, and this may allow me people who are more it may allow for people who are more vulnerable to have a financial capital to pay for higher education studies and then fulfill their goal, this flourishing of humanity and building responsible citizens with critical thinking. The last two ideas, understanding that I don't have that much time, I believe that here we need to think about what potential users of university systems are thinking. Last week, we were talking at the International Forum of the Youth, and part of what surprised me the most is the what young people think, or many of the young people think, which is that universities do not fulfill their needs of the real world. We cannot just look the other way, and we must know that there are other ways of learning. At the moment, there are other logics of relationships, and sometimes universities cannot answer to the demands of the accelerated world of today. So if we continue to think that micro credentials is just a way for them to continue to add credits, maybe we're not understanding to reach an entire degree. We're not understanding the aspirations of many young people, because they also use them to resolve specific qualification issues to access certain life projects that are not the same life projects that we used to have. They're not based on the aspiration to work for a very long time at the same company. They may be more related to entrepreneurship, other ways of acknowledging and accompanying social development processes that not necessarily go through the typical careers and or degrees. And I wanted to stress what we were saying before. So when does the university teach me how to be a leader? This is what they said at this forum. When does the university teach me how to approach a conversation with a potential employer? These things are relevant for young people. And a final idea is that I would like to stress on the fact that micro-credentials, or the concern about the quality of micro-credentials that you're proposing with universities, is giving a task to universities which is no small feat. Sometimes, if we want to reach the most vulnerable areas of Colombia, we go to an institute and they are offering things that are completely irrelevant. And this means universities need to conduct an intersectorial study of pertinence. And this is not only what academics believe, but also what territories are demanding. And the university, as a center for thought, has the political responsibility to start proposing offerings adapted to reality and the actual conditions in the field. And also, the complaints about the quality of micro-credentials happens because the universities of the country have not taken enough initiative to reach the territory in as much as society is demanding it. We cannot continue to think solely on the central model. That people, in order to access quality universities, they have to go to one of the main 4 cities of the country. A quality university has to be deployed in the territory with a differential offering, obeying to the realities, but also the expectations of this population, which is looking for higher or tertiary education, but not from the point of view of the traditional degrees, but an intersectorial and collective proposition that can give them quality education, and that can be brought to contexts in which a 5-year degree is not so easy to guarantee. How am I doing in terms of time? Very good. You were very respectful of the time. All of you were very respectful of the time. I know we have a lot to talk about, but I thought this was a cherry on top for this section. The first presentation encouraged us to remember that this is a concept that is under construction, and that when a concept is under construction and when there's so much debate, we can participate in this debate. So I think this encourages us to debate and see how we understand this. And Professor Brown also reminded of why this topic is being now incentivized and also vis-a-vis what is happening in Colombia and in other countries, well, the quality assurance system and the governmental decisions are pressuring us to move along those lines. And Professor Brown also started talking to us about the how, and we have an example of the Javeriana University as to the how it is being implemented. There is an analysis, and Felipe closed all of this with a very important reflection, which is why we ask you to participate in this scenario. We should remember that we cannot walk a path without knowing what our goal is and what our context is and what we're doing things for. Thank you very much. And now what we will do, well, there are questions on the chat which are being answered by our panelists on the chat as well, as we said, and we will now launch a survey. The idea is that we have 3 minutes to answer it. We will ask specifically about the management of micro-credentials in higher education. There are 10 aspects here that we heard about in different scenarios, essential aspects to bear in mind in the management of micro-credentials in higher education. So if you could please tell us what are the 5 most important aspects to consider out of the 10 that you have on screen. I'll give you 3 minutes and then we will publish the results. And we will give a round. We will pass it over to our panelists so they can talk about the results. We may have forgotten some important elements. So if you select other, kindly write on the chat other, and then the aspect that you believe is not included here and that is essential for the management of micro-credentials in higher education. Thank you very much. Thank you, all those of you who are already answering. We'll give you another 2 minutes so you can continue to participate, and then we'll share the results. Okay, so some of you are saying it disappeared. Okay, so let me just see what happened. We'll launch it again. There you go. We'll launch it again. Those of you who already answered, if you could kindly answer again. There's some time to answer. If you could do so quickly. Okay, we'll give you 1 more minute. Okay, we'll finalize the voting now so we can talk about this. But we'll remind you that this is part of a larger project, so we'll continue with this conversation in different scenarios. So I will now share the results, and if the speakers can please confirm that they are seeing the results of this survey. 72% of the answers say an essential element to touch upon in terms of the management of higher education institutions for micro-credentials are institutional policies and curricular models. We've got 60% of the audience who says that it should be the systems to evaluate learning and skills. And on a third position, we have institutional planning and design of strategies. The 3 aspects with a lower number of votes. We have 23% for the strengthening of student autonomy or independence, then conversations and agreements with the productive system, and 35% 100% financial sustainability. So vis-a-vis these results, we would like to have a brief round of interventions to see what our panelists think. Shall we start in reverse order of the presentations with Juan Felipe? Yes, so 2 quick reactions. I think if micro-credentials are offering the development of specific competencies, the big challenge is how we assess these competencies, how do we evaluate them, and also the aspect of whether the university can train these skills, which is a very necessary reflection, because if the value proposal is that we develop certain skills, we need to see how we're doing it and how and the fact that we understand that competencies or skills do not develop in 60 hours, they develop lifelong. And what makes someone competent in data management does not mean they will be competent in that area in a year. So I think this is an area of deep debate. It is no small feat, no small topic, and we need to think about evaluation models. Secondly, I believe that we need to evaluate institutional policies and curricular models to precisely make headway in what I just said. How can micro credentials build and provide answers to needs and expectations with links to what the territories are thinking? And I would like to make one final comment. I think the private sector needs to be involved, not because they need to decide on the contents ultimately, but because it is an actor that in the construction of public value has the responsibility of accompanying the training of people who will then be part of their operating and management models. So this is no trivial debate. Yes, we need to start talking to them, but we also need to have the perspective of universities. The fact that the private sector can accompany and offer funding to these micro-credentials does not authorize them to define the topics to be introduced in the trainings, and we need to have the necessary conversation so that the offering reaches whoever it needs to reach, and that the subjects registering in these programs should stay on the program and should not drop out, because we are talking here about appropriation of knowledge and having people access knowledge which is profitable for society at large. Thank you very much, Juan Felipe. Exactly, evaluation policies and conversation with the productive sector are three fundamental access to make headway in this topic. Carlos Eduardo, what do the results tell you? Well, thank you very much. They tell me that there is a very high level of consensus and a lot of awareness on the side of higher education institutions and a high probability of being able to manage it outside of the traditional silo concession in different institutions or disciplines. In our case, we conceive these micro-credentials within a very interdisciplinary overview and perspective. In social communication, we see the field as a post-discipline, well beyond environmental studies that refer to other disciplines. So we use these permanent interdisciplinary dialogues. Actually, at Javeriana, our students have the possibility to do 2 pre-graduate courses with just 1 registration. We call it multiple program. And with this modality, many of our students, around 30% of our total 1,600 in the case of social communication, can access a second pre-graduate course. And then we can create very flexible routes and fluid routes And we can create also shared micro-credentials. For example, we're already talking to the School of Economics for a micro-credential on entrepreneurship. And we are talking to other programs, similar programs. In the case of AFACON, which is the Colombian Association of Communication Schools, we are talking about the dynamic created by the National Accreditation Council to look for quality in the creation of skills. I think, as my colleague said, we need to know very well what skills we're talking about, how are they acquired, if it's in a pre-graduate course or a postgraduate course. So I perfectly agree with the results of the survey, but I also think that we need this dialogue with the external sector, which should be permanent, not for them to make the decisions for us, but because students legitimately have a right to access their profession. So we are in constant conversations with our graduates, with the external sector via our traineeships, and this gives us a lot of clues for this constant evaluation, this permanent evaluation. Thank you very much, Carlos Eduardo. Alejandra, what do you think about these answers and what you're related to what you're doing at the Universidad Javeriana? Alejandra? She's maybe not online anymore. Okay, so then we'll move on to Professor Brown. Professor Brown, tell us what you think about these results. What do you think about this survey? I think he's offline as well. I think he's a goodbye on the chat. Okay, so thank you very much. And with this, we will finalize the first section. Professor Brown said goodbye. Oh, thank you very much, Cecilia. I didn't see it. So now I'd like to show you that all of this input is being collected for the ongoing project. And these inputs can guide higher education institutions, and also echoing what was said before, the countries that are involved in different sectors to move on in the field of micro-credentials. I would like to thank the speakers very much, the speakers who were part of this first session. And for the second part of this session, we will now focus on quality and quality assurance. And for that, we have with us Dr. Brian McGuire. Dr. McGuire, welcome. Thank you very much. He's Director of Quality Assurance and the Quality of Qualifications in Ireland. Since 2005, he was Director of Academic Studies in the Council of Higher Education of this entity that I mentioned before. He was Director of the Creative Technology School at the Institute of Art, Design and Technology of Donlogger, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, in Ireland, and he was before professor at the Bangor University. Dr. McGuire has a degree in psychology from the University College Dublin. He has a PhD from the University of California, former member of the European Qualification Institute and the Network of Correspondents of Bologna, and president of the Agency for the European Agency for Quality Assurance. And it is a well-renowned expert in quality assurance, and it is a pleasure for us to listen to him today and to get to know these insights and tips that he brings to us to take us closer to micro-credentials and quality assurance. Dr. McGuire.
Good day, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. Let me see if I can find my slides. Okay, is that working? Are people seeing slides now?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay,
Thank you.
Okay, and then thank you for that introduction. I'm the Director of Integration now in Quality and Qualifications Ireland. Say a little bit of Quality and Qualifications Ireland because it shapes the way I present micro-credentials. So Quality and Qualifications Ireland is the national agency, government agency, responsible for the quality assurance of all post-secondary education and training, including higher education. It's also the National Qualifications Authority, which is responsible for the national framework of qualifications, and in which all public and private qualifications are included. It's also the National Academic Recognition Information Centre, which is the centre established under the Lisbon Recognition Convention to promote information about the recognition of qualifications under the Lisbon Recognition Convention, which is served, as you probably know, as the template for the global UNESCO Recognition Convention on Qualifications in Higher Education, which was adopted last year. And as well as these functions, we are also an awarding body. So we make qualifications, we offer qualifications in our own right for the private higher education system in Ireland. They don't have their own university title, they don't have powers to make awards in their own right. So QQI serves as the authority that not alone accredits them, but actually makes the awards to each individual student. The reason I've mentioned those different functions is because they each touch on the phenomenon of micro-credentials in different ways, and in particular on the quality assurance of micro-credentials. Professor Brown mentioned earlier that a key part of the national policy in relation to micro-credentials, and indeed European policy more widely, is to try and build on the established qualifications frameworks. Ireland has one of the longest established qualifications frameworks in Europe. It's going back now almost 20 years. And it looks something like this. It's a 10-level framework where the qualifications on the left-hand side relate to both to school and to adult basic education. The ones towards the middle relate to both to vocational education and training, but also the earlier stages of higher education, the sub-degree studies. And then, of course, the higher levels, the purple studies are for both sub-degree studies, associate degree studies, and bachelor's and master's and doctoral studies. The Irish Qualifications Framework is, of course, oriented within the European framework. So both the European Framework for Lifelong Learning, which is an 8-level framework covering all studies from quite elementary studies to doctoral studies, and also to the Bologna Process Qualifications Framework, which has a short cycle, the first cycle, second cycle, and third cycle. One of the differences, and I just comment here, is to pause briefly on the difference. Why do we have two qualifications frameworks in Europe? The Bologna framework was originally established to promote the reform of the university studies in Europe almost 20 years ago. And the idea was to take the traditional long form studies, which in many countries lasted 5-6 years, and break them into more digestible chunks, the bachelor's, the master's, the doctoral cycle. This is what became the 3-cycle. And as part of that reform, there was an identification of what were the characteristics of the bachelor's, a master's, a doctorate, and broke them into big chunks and described them in terms of learning outcomes, and also set in train the process that led to the European standards and guidelines for quality assurance that would say how these would be quality assured. The reason I'm mentioning this again is because the European framework, the Bologna framework, did not anticipate micro-credentials. In fact, on the contrary, to reassure the stakeholders, both within the universities and in the traditional employers and professions, they emphasized actually the indivisibility of the cycle and the fact that the cycle was really important, so much so that the short cycle qualifications, the associate degree qualifications, were not even included politically until 2015, once the bachelor's and master's changes had been embedded. So in one sense, the Bologna process has been coming quite late to the idea of micro-credentials. The world has overtaken that set of reforms. I'm happy to say that within some countries, and including my own, there was already an anticipation of the need for qualifications that were not, as we call them here, major qualifications like the bachelor master. But we also anticipated that you could have minor qualifications. This is where you get certified credit for partial completion of a program, or special purpose qualifications, which were designed to reach some particular goal. Might be a specific vocational functional goal, or it might be an academic preparation goal of some description. And then supplemental qualifications were added on. So this was already present in the National Framework of Qualifications when it was established in 2003. So we can see here, if you like, the anticipation of what later became known as micro-credentials. And this is one of the reasons, I suppose, why the Irish higher education system has been quick to adopt micro-credentials, is because some of this work was already beginning before the letter. And there was also a national framework into which it could be inserted. And indeed, when we look at the National Framework of Qualifications, which are contained in the Irish Register of Qualifications, which represent the website there, there are in that database about just over 6,000 higher education programs in total. And of those, over 1,300 are fewer than 30 credits, or 30 credits or fewer. That would mean less than one semester or less rather, of academic effort. And so you can see there is already a significant base there of higher education practice that corresponds to something like micro-credentials. So clearly, the question now is how to quality assure the micro-credentials. And here, the Irish approach, echoing and in compliance with the European standards and guidelines for quality assurance in higher education, because they emphasize the importance of quality assurance with the higher education institution itself. This is a matter in the first instance of internal quality assurance of the processes that the university puts in place for the development of any program, be it a bachelor's program, a master's program, or indeed a shorter program that is a micro-credential. And all the public higher education institutions like Dublin City University, that Professor Brown comes from, and I see a colleague on the call from University College Cork. These institutions grant their own degrees and accredit their own programs. So they each have their internal processes for developing, approving, reviewing programs. The role of the external quality assurance agency, which is QQI, is to then review the procedures and how effective these procedures are operated by the institution. So not drilling down to the level of the individual programs, but in fact looking at the overall effectiveness of the, first of all, that they have the relevant procedures in place, that these procedures have been adapted for the different kinds of programs. So the procedures that a university might adopt, for example, to approve a new research doctoral program might be quite different from an approach to a new undergraduate program in liberal arts, might be different from a professional program in medicine. But each of them has to have an internal process whereby the program is developed, monitored, and so on. And the feedback from the learners who are taking part in those programs and from other stakeholders is incorporated into the practice of the university to whether both the identification of its learning outcomes, the assessment methodologies, the teaching and learning proposals, processes, and so on. Then the resulting program, the resulting qualification, can be included in the national framework qualifications. There's no doubt that the application of quality assurance procedures that were developed for larger programs are not necessarily fit for purpose. I see Mark Brown use the expression there in the chat, agile, and that's actually a very good description of the approach that a university needs to take in its internal quality assurance processes when dealing with micro-credentials. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is because the proportionality, the scale of the activity is smaller, but that in turn becomes an asset from a quality assurance perspective. Because one of the reasons why quality assurance was developed, formal quality assurance methods in higher education were developed, was to address the informational asymmetry between the learner and indeed employers on the one hand, and the university and the faculty on the other hand. So we're asking the professors and the faculty knows what goes into the degree, knows how the studies will be organized, knows how to be assessed. But how is this communicated and guaranteed to the outsider, as it were? And this outsider-insider split is when you're expecting those outsiders to make a commitment of 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, or whatever length to a long degree study program. They're asking them to take a big risk, and quality assurance is partly a matter of risk mitigation to ensure that when that investment of time and effort is made by the learner, that they will in fact get what they're looking for at the end of the day. They'll get proper education experience, and their qualification to get at the end will be recognized by the relevant external parties. When you come to a micro-credential, on the other hand, the value at risk for the individual learner is smaller. The study cycle by definition is shorter. There's more opportunities for changing, for rapid change, for these agile changes to the program, agile changes even to the content of the learning outcomes. If not within an individual iteration of a program, then certainly by the time the program comes to be offered around again. So it's more agile and more cost effective then. And that in turn means that the large upfront burden that you put on prior accreditation of a program, for example, by internal processes, isn't required. You need to have good design criteria, but you also need then to build in an agile response to the monitoring of how that program is being delivered and received by the people who are on the other end. So that is it. That's what we're talking here about, the questions of proportionality, consistency, and pragmatism. So that's, as a quality assurance agency working with independent universities, that has been QQI's approach. However, I mentioned we're also the quality assurance agency for private higher education institutions that don't have their own credentialing powers. And so in these instances, they come to QQI, and rather than approve their internal quality system and then allow them to accredit individual programs, we have to accredit each program. And that's the way we do it for degree programs, and have done for 20 or 30 years now. And that has ensured a very uniform standard in an emerging private sector, where and has helped to keep that sector both responsive to changing demands, while at the same time ensuring that the standards are maintained. However, the classic methodology we use for this is we appoint an expert panel to review the proposed program, and that's 3 or 4 people, including a student representative, who review the advanced documentation and then make feedback on that and have a site visit and prepare a report. This methodology we saw was disproportionate for the micro-credentials. So we changed a couple of years ago, we changed, and though we had used it for micro-credentials for many years, but in recent years, as the number of micro-credentials coming through was increasing, we found that it was not sustainable for us. So we instead devolved much more of the responsibility for organizing the assessment to the private providers themselves. but we still retain the approval rights both over how they have done each individual program and the final report that they prepare on the framework level. Because the key thing for micro-credentials in terms of the framework is both what level is it at on the framework? Is it roughly comparable to a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, in terms of the demand imposed, the complexity of the learning outcomes? And then, of course, the question is, are the learning outcomes, are they properly articulated? Do they have appropriate assessment methodologies and so on? Why do we go through all this effort? Can we not just let the market rip? Because that is another perspective, is that you can say, well, because the investment for a learner, for any individual micro-credential is not going to be so great. If it doesn't do what it says on the tin, then they won't get any business next year. And the employers won't send their workers, the students won't get jobs, the feedback loop will go. And unlike a degree where that could be 5 or 6 years down the road, for a micro-credential, you know in a few months whether it's doing what you expect, whether it's delivering the career outcomes that you expected it to deliver. Well, here we come to the question of recognition, and in particular, if credentials are to be accumulated or stacked. Not everybody wants to have them accumulated and stacked, but if we want to have the potential of an individual credential being accumulated, then we need to know that that framework level has been properly articulated, and that the quality assurance process there is a trail that can be followed to ensure that the outcomes have been delivered. And this is where the recognition leg kicks in, that we have articulation in terms of learning outcomes, use in the national framework, use of ECTS, documentation through the diploma supplement, and then the inclusion in databases. So I mentioned earlier the inclusion in the Irish Register of Qualifications, and the Irish Register of Qualifications will next year be linked to the emergent European qualifications data register as a way of providing cross-national access to verify the qualifications that are included, micro-credentials that are in the Irish system. And so that brings to that function that QQI has and that other agencies have around Europe of providing advice on the recognition of credentials that are crossing borders. So with that, I think I'm over time, but I'll conclude now and invite questions.
Muchísimas gracias, Professor Maguire.
Thank you very much, Professor Maguire. Your sound was quite bad, but we could communicate your reflection, and it's related to everything we're living within the institutions and at the national level. So the question is, how can we allow the market to choose or design the values and everything that we want to contribute with, and how an academia we can make a difference. We want to do it the best possible way, ensuring also to society that we are offering something they need. Even in Colombia, we see something very interesting. The latest survey has shown the legitimacy of the universities has increased considerably, and other institutions have been reducing this legitimacy. So it's important to maintain it like this so the society can trust in whatever we are offering them. So this is what you have presented in order to pay attention to the quality of this is fundamental. So if you agree, let's have the second survey of today's webinar in following the same dynamics. And we're going to launch the survey, 10 points, very much related to the previous one, because the idea is to speak about management. But in this case, management requires for quality insurance of micro-credentials. So thank you. You have 10 options, and I would like you to show out of these 10 the 5 most important ones, and we will give you 3 minutes for the voting. And when we finish, Professor Maguire, you can tell us what you think about the responses related to the survey. And also, we will gather some of the Q&As in order to close today's conference. Let me remind you that all of you sending questions via chat, it is very important for us, even if they cannot be answered today. We're gathering all these questions because this is a project, long-term project, and we will continue working on the subject. So the main questions of the sector are very important so we can advance in a pertinent way. So Professor Maguire, if you could get closer to your microphone because it was very difficult to hear you. Thank you very much on the interpreter's behalf. We have 2 more minutes. Thank you. And those of you who want to write questions to Professor Maguire on the chat. Okay, 1 more minute.
Muy bien. Entonces vamos a hacer por ahora un...
Very well, then. So we are going to stop it and share the results. Okay. So within the percentages, the 5 aspects that our participants think are the most important ones in the quality assurance of micro-credentials, we have 60% in national ecosystems in order to understand accepting them and using them. We also have 63% of people who answer about the importance of the quality insurance related to micro-credentials, integrality, and we also have as a third most voted aspect that management of the institution understand and participate in this implementation. So the 3 ones that obtain less votes, then we have in strengthening cybernetic security, 26%, and ensuring transparency of the process in front of the state and society, 31%. And then we have 34% having an internal team qualified for the subject management of these aspects. Professor Maguire, can you tell us what you think about these results and whether they are related to this process that you have mentioned?
Professor Maguire?
Professor Maguire, can you hear me?
Do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you, yes.
Okay. Professor, how do you see the results of this quest?
Repeat the question, please. I missed the question.
Yes, of course. So we have the results of the quest. I don't know if you can see the results of the quest.
Not seeing them.
Maybe you can see. Okay, we asked to our participants for the most important aspects for management of for quality assurance of micro-credentials in higher education. So we have a list of 10 aspects, and each person choose 5 of them. And the answers of what are those aspects. Some of the most important for the participants. The first one is the integrality of the comprehensiveness of the quality assurance systems that support the micro-credentials. We can say that in the second place, we have the need of the national ecosystem for understand and accept and permit the comparability of the micro-credentials. And in the third place, we can say that it's important that the directive of the institution understand and commit to this approach. How do you see these answers? What is your opinion about this?
Okay, it is an interesting trade-off that we made. I described in the reason I went into the history of the Bologna process was because I talked about the anxieties that some university professors had in countries that if students didn't stay, if we didn't hold on to students for 5 or 6 years at least, then our university reputation would be tarnished by the lightweight qualifications that they get. I see a similar kind of pattern or anxiety on the part of universities, and it's understandable that they have to have integrity in the qualifications, that they have to understand them. However, in the case of micro-credentials, their value comes not from their durability or the fact that they're from a long-standing institution, but from the fact that the knowledge they have is just in time. And the individual micro-credential has its, if you like, its standalone value rather than the value that comes just from the parent institution. And so I suppose what I'm saying is that there's a risk that the very virtue of a micro-credential, its fluidity, its responsiveness, its agility, is compromised if we attend too much to making it right, to be sure, to being certain that it has jumped through, satisfied all the requirements of the process. So we lighten the process as much as possible, and then we try and use the marketplace and the feedback that we get from it. So it's better to do it sooner and try it and get the feedback and see if it works, both as even as it's going along, even as it's being delivered, and certainly as once it's being received by the workforce or by whoever is employing the graduates. So I think there's a different integrity, almost has a slightly different meaning in the context of micro-credential. The integrity, its validity and currency is part of the integrity rather than trying to get all of this established ex ante.
Thank you very much, Professor Maguire. Yes, we have here a lot of aspects to consider in management of quality assurance. And as you say, it's very important to prioritize what is the most important thing and how to improve this kind of processes without have a lot of charge in this one. How not to lose flexibility in these needs to have more quality assurance in the micro-credentials. So thank you very much. This is, as I said before, just the beginning of a very important dialogue in our country as Colombia, but as we said, is in all of the world. So the people for the countries in Africa, in Europe, in Latin America knows how this aspect is important right now to dialogue and to have some clarities about this. Okay. So, bueno, con esta
so with this final comments of the discussion that we are having from different countries related to quality assurance and micro-credentials. So we want to close the second part of this first reflection on quality. We know that we have to keep discussing with public policy actors and people in charge of this within the institutions in order to move forward the best way possible and for universities not to enter into this new logic as one more actor, and rather but an actor who knows what they are doing and offering trust to society and also relating to other actors to move forward. And also one of the main objectives that we have is to contribute to the project, the EQUAM-LA project, which is the Erasmus Plus, including all these reflections. And I would like to give the floor to Elizabeth Colucci, who from Obreal is going to give us some conclusions, Obreal Global, about what we have presented here and how this is helping this project to strengthen its role and objectives. So Elizabeth, you have the floor, and thank you very much for being here with us.
Okay, thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'm going to take advantage of the interpretation to do my conclusions in English. First of all, thank you to all of the speakers. I think that was extremely rich. I hope you enjoyed their presentations as much as I did. They were also very complimentary. I'm going to say a few words to summarize what we heard and then offer a few thoughts on how we can use this information and this knowledge in the context of the EQUAM-LA project. We started with an introduction to micro-credentials, and I think Mark Brown framed that very well. He made an important distinction in terms of how micro-credentials are potentially seen in different systems and by different institutions. For example, he said that in many cases, micro-credentials are still seen as extras, as supplementary, as not part of the core of the curricular offer of an institution. In some cases, and increasingly so, and we can cite cases in Europe and also particularly in the Irish system, micro-credentials are being seen more and more as building blocks for core programs, for core credentials, and part of the formal education system, not necessarily just supplementary. In the best of cases, they're probably seen and used as both. I think we had some interesting presentations from some of our Colombian colleagues, our colleague Juan Felipe from Antioquia, who mentioned that micro-credentials have to be very much contextualized and the purpose has to be contextualized. So in the context of Colombia, where you have a society that is faced with conflict and post-conflict challenges, where you have difficulties with access to higher education, particularly in some regions, rural regions and territories, micro-credentials have to be seen within the broader picture of access to higher education, skilling, but skilling towards a particular purpose in terms of societal cohesion and not just economic advancement. The case we had from Javariana was also very interesting because it showed how one Colombian institution in particular was building its mission around flexible curricula based in transdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, competencies, and also transversal skills, where micro-credentials are starting to play a role, but again, more so as supplemental and not necessarily as core building blocks, despite the fact that the programs indeed are very flexibilized. And I think that's an important differentiation. When we looked at the polls of the audience, it was interesting to see how much emphasis was put on the need for strong institutional policies, strong institutional training on what a micro-credential is and how a particular institution is strategizing around a micro-credential. But it was also clear that there's a need for a clear national framework, and that the role of micro-credentials within the national higher education qualifications framework and within the national quality assurance system also needs to be strongly clarified. This brings us to the EQUAM-LA project. The EQUAM-LA project, as you may all know, is a capacity building project for higher education. It is led by the University of Murcia in collaboration with Obrial Global, the organization I represent, and a number of quality assurance agencies and institutions in 4 South American countries, South and Central American countries, Colombia, of course, being one, Argentina, Panama, and Nicaragua. What's important about EQUAM-LA is that it is trying to build capacity at the institutional level in terms of building quality assurance systems, but it's also trying to build capacity to articulate the institutional level quality assurance with national quality assurance in the effort of enhancing recognition and enhancing recognition decisions taken at the institutional level and the national level in these respective countries. So the linkage between strong institutional quality cultures and systems and enhanced recognition in the South American continent and wider afield is clear. As Ramon Torrent said at the beginning of the webinar, this is not a static project. We have to adapt to the times. It is clear that micro-credentials have exploded on the agenda. It's a very hot topic issue. There's a lot of, I think, misunderstanding around micro-credentials, and that was why we agreed with ESCUM today to propose this webinar. I think it will be important for the project now as we look at internal quality assurance management in universities and the extent to which it is robust enough to deal with new types of qualifications and credentialing and how they fit into the institutional architecture when it comes to programs. And it will be important when we look at systems and how they're adapting and flexibilizing to accommodate these changes as well. I would just leave you with the comments we had now from Brian and also from Mark Brown about the importance of having agile quality assurance, how our tendency perhaps as higher education institutions is to always want to regulate more when we're confronted with something new or different or foreign, but potentially with micro-credentials, the point is not to continue to regulate more, but rather to regulate less, but with guidance and flexibility and a common understanding about what we're actually dealing with. That's all I have for today. I think this was the start of an important conversation. Many thanks to ESCUM, thanks to all the participants. Thank you to the speakers for their excellent contributions. We will be having more webinars for the EQUAM-LA project in the beginning of next year. So we hope you will join us again. Thank you. And I give it back to the other Elizabeth.
Muchas gracias, Elizabeth. Muy bien, entonces, como lo
Thank you very
mencioné.
much, Elizabeth. So as we said at the beginning, 2021, we didn't know that this was going to be a strong subject for 2022. We will keep working. Please, all your questions, observations, you can send them to the emails of those leading the EQUAM-LA project that we have shared in the invitation, and of course, Obrial Global and the Colombian Association of Universities. Thank you very much for allowing us to express these reflections and allowing us to work with you in this dialogue. Good afternoon, in some places, good evening in others, and we hope that we have the best of the closing. Happy holidays and see you next year. Thank you.